Greetings, friends, greetings, colleagues, everyone to the third Dean Foley of the year, the preparable listing here, that is a norm of the year, Dean Forum number 3. As the Robinson, I have been here, Janet is busted Stackert, Alice, Bessenser, Walt. Welcome you, and please get a minute if you haven't had the chance to do. So with further ado, it is my great honor to bring to you from Pentateuch Stackert.
So thank you very much to Dean Jim Robinson for the invitation to participate in this morning, and to all of you for coming to talk about this book, and especially thanks in advance to Aaron for the response. I will briefly introduce the book, mostly because I think the important part is to hear Aaron and her response, but I'll also tell one little story about writing it. So, to introduce the book, I would say in many cases the books that we write are books that we wish that we could find to read, but having not found them, we take it upon ourselves to write in those books. And I would say that's the case in this instance. I've been thinking about and writing about Deuteronomy for a long time now, and because of that, I've become increasingly attuned to claims about it that are largely taken for granted in scholarly. In my research, both in this book and in my other work, I enjoy taking on these scholarly dividends. And that's one of the main goals that I had in writing Deuteronomy and the Pentateuch. For example, we regularly talk about Deuteronomy and other biblical texts as biblical literature. But what does it really mean to understand Deuteronomy as literature? And if we understand it as literature, what kind of literature is it? These are basic questions, ones that people overlook, but I wanted to take them on and think about them. Related to these questions are two others that I treat. What is the difference between reading Deuteronomy as literature and reading it as scripture? And can we read this text as literature and still take seriously its historical situatedness? Biblical studies has sometimes presented literary analysis as solely the domain of synchronic, final form study of biblical texts. But I would suggest just the opposite, that really taking biblical texts seriously as literature requires doing historical analysis of them. Another long-standing scholarly given concerning Deuteronomy, one also related to questions of historical situatedness, has been its deity. Going back now more than 2 centuries, scholars have tended to associate Deuteronomy with the reform of King Josiah of Judah, as described in 2 Kings 22 and 23, what is referred to as the Divinity hypothesis after the one who came up with Blissville and Divinity. Yet this argument too naively assumes the historical accuracy of the 2 Kings text. I thus offer a new argument on the basis of various evidence, including some underappreciated Neo-Assyrian evidence, that the Deuteronomic work likely stems from the early 7th century BCE. And I would say, just as an aside, this is one of my favorite arguments in the book. Scholars have also struggled to make sense of the use of source material in Deuteronomy, both other material now in the Bible and other ancient Near Eastern source material. I try to show how each of these engagements works and in what measure and to what end. Finally, I try to show how the texts of Deuteronomy are read differently across time. The distinctive storyline in the original work, I argue, is mostly lost once it's situated within the Pentateuch. Among other things, this makes way for the reception of Deuteronomy primarily as law rather than as narrative. In answering all of these questions and other ones too, I try to offer interpretations of specific passages from Deuteronomy to exemplify why the arguments that I make matter for understanding its text. So that's a little overview. Now, one story about writing the book. This book I had initially planned as a jointly authored project but my colleague with whom I was planning to write it for Levinson got busy with other projects and didn't ultimately have time to spend on it. Our divorce on the project was amicable, and it turned out to be good in ways that I didn't appreciate at first. This was because my ideas have evolved as I've continued to work on Deuteronomy over the years. It would thus have been difficult in the end, I think, to co-author the book because my views have become increasingly different from those of my would-be co-author. But I take that change to be a good thing. For me, one of the great joys of scholarship is to continue to learn and to grow, and this book was precisely such an opportunity. And just as a caveat, I expect that my ideas will continue to grow and develop and change about Deuteronomy, and so I really think of this as my last word on the subject. But I'll stop there and turn things over to Aaron and say thank you. That's should be.
Good afternoon. First of all, I'd like to thank Dean Robinson for inviting me to give a response and participate in the Dean's Forum. After the last 3 years, it is wonderful to gather as a community and to celebrate one another's achievements and enjoy the pleasures of intellectual conversation. Many thanks to the staff at the Divinity School and to all of you who came out today. And most of all, thank you and congratulations to Professor Stackert on publication of Deuteronomy and the Pentateuch. I have learned so much from reading it, and I anticipate returning to it as both a resource and model of scholarship. In the introduction, Professor Stackert sets out the book's purpose. It advances its own thesis in relation to the primary text and relevant ancient evidence, even as it seeks to understand and make its claims in relation to the various trajectories of modern critical scholarship on Deuteronomy. While meant as a monograph, then, the volume bears some features of a handbook. This last observation stayed in my mind as I read on. This publication manages to sustain a continuous argument while also containing chapters that stand individually. I can foresee many a scholar and student keeping this book at hand when preparing a lecture, adding a footnote, or reaching for a reliable reference. Indeed, the chapters build upon one another, culminating in the final analysis of the arguments advanced concerning the dating. That is my favorite. Right there. So chapters unfold along the following themes. First, you answer the deceptively simple question, what is Deuteronomy? Analyzing along the way the nature of this work as a composition within the larger context of Pentateuch book composition. While earlier scholars had characterized the compositional nature of D as it is uncoordinated in terms of content, discontinuous in terms of style and theme, contradictory or alternatively explicative, you argue for the literariness of the piece, drawn here on Benjamin Harshaw to cast light on the fictive world or internal field of reference implicated in any account of its compository nature. Literary approaches move the conversation beyond reductive binaries toward a more synthetic account. This also shapes how one considers the legal kernels, chapter 12 to 26, at the heart of the Deuteronomy scroll, as embedded within what you term Dan's story world. From this point, we're able to move on to the nature of the composition and the relationship of Deuteronomy to its earlier sources. The work of revision within Deuteronomy must be considered within what you term the fictive framework. Over the course of the following chapters, you lay out the historical context which necessitated Dean's reassessment and revision of the holistic religious and political worldview, drawing in archaeological evidence from the region. One of the remarkable features of this book is the vast amount of scholarship Professor Stackert synthesizes within its pages. As he observes, the last 2 centuries have given rise to numerous studies and entrenched schools of thought about its source material, its relationship to other books within the Pentateuch, and most importantly, its dating. With clarity and precision, Professor Stackert summarizes and evaluates previous scholarship before advancing his own argument. I raise this feature of his writing as instructive for doctoral students and junior scholars alike. He evaluates and critiques without scathing invectives. Rather, he exercises judicious selectivity and charitable appreciation, acknowledging the various contexts within which scholars wrote and the various, albeit imperfect, contributions they had made. This is a model of how to advance scholarly conversation as an ongoing dialogue. The running conversation of previous scholarship raised questions for me about historiography. In many ways, the assessments of various positions constitute an erudite exposition of where the field has been, and more importantly, where the field is now. One place where I found the discussion especially poignant for scholars outside the field in Hebrew Bible is in the 5th chapter on dating. Here you lay out the once dominant position espoused by Julius Wellhausen, who characterized Israelite religion as evolving from the prophetic and charismatic to the morbid and the legalistic. Within this declension narrative, Deuteronomy, as you so eloquently point out, served as a turning point from which there was no return. Students of New Testament literature, no doubt, hear specters of former supersessionist orientations towards the New Testament. The larger field of biblical studies continues to shake off the dust of earlier historiography. While this is not a book about historiography per se, it indeed is an re-narrative, and if I might be so bold, puts into practice a disciplined and capacious approach to inclusive of literary and material evidence. As you rightly acknowledge, the readerly anticipated discussion of the dating of Deuteronomy earlier in the work, but you plant the seeds that come to fruition in the final chapter as you assemble the evidence for a more clear idea of Deuteronomy's place in the first half of the 7th century, with the possibility of an even more precise placement in the first third. Where your conclusion is not a drastic departure from the 19th century belief of scholars like Stackert and Wellhausen, you have shifted the ground on which such arguments are built. Just as your first chapter asks a seemingly simple question, what is Deuteronomy? Your final chapter shows how another seemingly straightforward question of dating reveals how fraught historical inquiry and the interpretation of evidence may be. To put this question slightly more pointedly, I would love to hear Professor Stackert look forward to the future of the field when it comes to Deuteronomy and the Pentateuch. As new evidence emerges about the larger historical context or archaeological evidence or older evidence is reevaluated, what questions remain under or unexplored? From chapter 3 onwards, the relationship to Hittite sources play a prominent role in helping clarify the dating. As you lay various arguments highlighting parallels within Hittite treaties, it is clear that such evidence demands circumspection. Moving beyond parallelomania, it seems that such evidence within your working forth but does not determine interpretation. Striking that balance seems worthy of further reflection. In my research on the reception of biblical literature among leaders and Christians, I am often struck by their encyclopedic knowledge of their scriptural texts. Origen's ability to pull related images from the breadth of scripture is well known. From the pulpit, John Chrysostom and Augustine brought the biblical word to bear on the quotidian challenges facing their audience while leading their congregation in collective reflection on the divine. Ephrem and Jacob of Saru, like their Greek and Latin speaking counterparts, returned frequently to Genesis and the Psalms in concert in New Testament texts to diagnose human frailty and prescribe the divinely ordained therapies found within its verses. While other books within the Hebrew Bible may come to mind more readily when they follow early Christian interpretation, Deuteronomy's shaping of historical memory and religious perspectives radiates within the New Testament and Christian literature far removed from its immediate dating. One obvious example is the programmatic statement used in Matthew 22:37, harkening back to Deuteronomy 6:5. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. Well, Professor Stackert's examination and reception history of the Deuteronomy scroll considers a more immediate diachronic reign, emphasizing Chronicles and Nehemiah and the Temple Scroll and Qumran. I would be curious to hear Professor Stackert's thoughts on how a deeper appreciation of Deuteronomy's compositional nature and historical context might illuminate the ways later readers received the text. The ways that later biblical authors and later commentators elided earlier sources found in the Pentateuch invites us to consider the distinctions between the scriptural reading practices that Professor Stackert distinguishes from the literary historical approaches his work espouses. Within the introduction, there's a clear-eyed exposition of the differences between an approach to Deuteronomy as literature and scripture. To claim that passages are both enigmatic but ultimately cohesive indicates a posture toward the biblical text that upholds the authority characteristic of a scriptural approach. It's engaging the work of Barbara Johnson Smith Professor Stackert combines these binaries with her distinction between real discourse and fictive discourse. Quote, for those who endorse the category, Scripture functions as real discourse. It is language conveyed by putatively real beings, in this case the deity, and directed to a real audience in the real world, even if not to a single audience in a single moment. As the monograph proceeds, it unfolds the possibilities of approaching Deuteronomy as fictive discourse, representation. This distinction grounds the study, advancing a neo-documentaric approach. Professor Stackert characterizes the arc of this narrative as advancing from the literary to the scriptural, as he leads us through the various stages of development, pointing out the various emendations that occurred along the way. While much of the book is focused on the scroll of Deuteronomy, as the book proceeds, it becomes more and more evident the importance of the title. This study contextualizes Deuteronomy in a way that illuminates his relationship with, not simply inclusion in, the Pentateuch. Perhaps it is greedy of me to ask, but if this volume takes the reader from the literary to the scriptural, can you imagine a second volume with a reimagined the scriptural afterlives of this text? One question that I had throughout the reading of the book was how Deuteronomy shapes the character of Moses as a dominant speaker. And I think this perhaps to reflect on your larger publications, your previous books. I think that be interested to hear how Levian would provide some of those observations and think differently now. After reading this work, I will return to my objects of study, work into the ways Deuteronomy was received and transformed by later readers. I have always admired teachers and scholars who not only persuade and inform, but more importantly, excite others to realize the critical nature of their inquiry. In this measure, Professor Stackert has succeeded admirably. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Karen. I oftentimes come to these kinds of events and I hear people summarize and reflect on someone's work, and I oftentimes get like that's a better summary than I would give of my own work. It is probably the case that other people feel like that too, and so it's very flattering to hear somebody present my work so well, and to, I think, appreciate the kinds of things that I was wanting to do and trying to do. Even from the very beginning, we commented on the fact that I suggest that the book is something of a handbook as well as a monograph. And part of that is the series that the book is in. It's in a series called the Anchor Reference Library. And so it's meant to be accessible to those who maybe aren't specialists. And I wanted to do something that would advance new argument and thus look more like a modern map. For also do it in a way that was accessible. And so, like, even while we were at Team Lunch, I mentioned the press was very clear. They said, we won't do footnotes, we'll only do endnotes. And I said, I like endnotes, I want footnotes. But they thought that this would be more accessible. They also said, well, only do Roman font. They said, we won't do non-Roman fonts. So, like, all of the languages are transliterated into Roman fonts, and hopefully that achieves what they say they want, that it'll be more accessible. My writing style tends to be very direct, unornamented. Every sentence is about 11 words long. I can sell that. Only too that makes it readable and accessible. I think that Aaron is right that the chapters stand individually to some extent, and I expect that a lot of readers will engage one chapter or another chapter, but maybe not the full book. I hope they read the full book, but I'm sure that they sometimes won't, and if they don't, I hope that individual chapters can still be useful. It's also the case, Eric mentioned that there was a lot of scholarship that's engaged. One of the great things about Pentateuchal research is that there's a long history to it, and that's also one of the very challenging things about it. And so it can be a little bit daunting to find a way in. And I'm hoping that this book is a way in for some folks. Now, maybe on to a couple of the questions that Eric asked. And thinking about the future of the field, what's left to do? Eric brought up the question of Hittite influence. And I dealt with this somewhat briefly. This is a point of controversy within the field right now. One of the referees on the book, once they read the whole manuscript, wrote, the section that deals with Hittite influence, this is good, and I agreed, but why is it in here? Like, nobody takes this seriously, which I'm sort of sympathetic to, because, that's in the nicest way possible kind of where I come out, on this point too, that this isn't really a serious kind of data set for us to consider in thinking about the composition of Deuteronomy. But it has been a topic. It originated back in the 1950s and 60s, and then kind of fell out of the conversation, and it's been revived in the last decade or so. And I think that it's wrong, but it's something that has been revived, and so I wanted to treat it to some extent. And so this might be a place where I am a little concerned about giving it too much press, but I'm certainly not going to make it go away. So I think that it's a kind of Urveg, it's a kind of misdirection in scholarship, but it's there. So I felt like I needed to treat it. The question about reception, I think Aaron is exactly right. I tried to deal with the very earliest reception of this material. And in part, that was because I wanted to deliver it in some way. I think one of the challenges of reception history is how do you delimit your corpus? And I decided that I would focus on the very early reception of Deuteronomic material. But I also thought, this was a good way of doing this because I think what is established already in that early history of reception then is replicated in much of what we see later. And so already in that early reception, I think we get a kind of formation of methods and emphases that continue to show up in subsequent reception. But an example maybe related to one of the arguments that I make in the book in the reception history that I don't really deal with in the book does pertain to New Testament perception of Deuteronomic material. And it is the case that both in early Judaism and in early Christianity, Deuteronomy of all of the texts of the Hebrew Bible is more popular than the other ones. Psalms is also popular, Isaiah is popular, but Deuteronomy, very popular, say among the Dead Sea Scrolls. If you just count the numbers of copies, Deuteronomy is very popular. You count citations in the New Testament, Deuteronomy is very popular. But one of the arguments that I make in the book pertains to the story that Deuteronomy is telling about Israel's past of origins. And I make the argument that the Deuteronomic perspective on the Israelites' wilderness journey is one in which they spend 40 years in the wilderness and there's no generation change. So the story that's very popular, that's known from Numbers 13 and 14, is the spies story where the Israelites are unfaithful, and so God condemns them to spend 40 years in the wilderness, and that is to wipe out the generation of Egypt, and only their children, the next generation, would enter into the promised land. D tells a story that's different than that. It tells a story of the same generation that left Egypt spending 40 years in the wilderness. The wilderness is then transformed from a period of punishment to one of preparation and training. And on that basis, then they enter into the land prepared to observe the laws that God gives. I think we have a kind of reflex of this in the story of Jesus's temptation in the wilderness in the Gospels, in the New Testament, where the time in the wilderness is seen as a kind of time of preparation and testing and training. And that's precisely the way that we see this 40 years in the wilderness described in, say, texts like Deuteronomy 8, but other texts in Deuteronomy as well. And so this is a case where I think this kind of theme of wilderness as time of testing and preparation comes through in early Christian reception of this material in ways that stand in contrast to what we see, say, in Numbers 13 and 14. And then, in terms of other scriptural afterlives, I think this is fertile ground, right? There's more of this work to do. I was talking to a student the other day about how to do reception history and how people do it in ways that I think are most productive. I think that it's really helpful to be able to compare and contrast a reading of a biblical text in its historical and literary context, and then ways in which it changes and develops or is read differently in the history of its reception. And so sometimes reception is done in a way that divorces the interpretation of these texts in later time periods from, say, the compositional period. And I want to hold these two together. And I think in doing that, there are opportunities for new understandings and better appreciation of the receptions itself. So maybe I should stop here, but just again say thank you for really gelling with us. Okay. Us.
Well, thank you, Professor Stackert, Professor Walsh, for a wonderful introduction. So I was what I need. I would like to ask, led by your comments, that this both reflects sort of your growth and really some of the ideas. I was curious if you could mention one or two of those ideas where you sort of changed stably and how you came to adopt a different perspective.
Yeah. There are embarrassingly many examples that I could offer. Sometimes it's difficult once you put something in print to then change your mind. But it happens to me. I feel forced sometimes, maybe against what I would prefer. One example that I spent some time on in the book is when Deuteronomic texts are revising other material that ends up being good and good. So we have what is sometimes referred to as interbiblical exegesis, or just literary revision of earlier texts that we have access to, and we can just compare them to each other. The question arises, why would an author revise earlier material? What is that author's stance towards it? Are they meaning to supplement the earlier material? Are they meaning to replace the earlier material? What's the goal? Because, of course, in the case of Deuteronomic material, some of what it revises also shows up in the Pentateuch. And so when these texts are compiled into the compiled Pentateuch that we have, we might say that either this was the plan all along, right, to set the revisionary text alongside of its patrimony, or maybe the compilation of the Pentateuch really undermined the literary intent of a text like Deuteronomy. And part of that is also a question then about, what the stance towards that source material is in terms of its prestige or authority. And in the past, following some other scholars, including, I mentioned that originally I was planning to write this book with Barry Levinson, who's a colleague at the University of Minnesota. He has argued, and I followed this argument previously, that the Deuteronomic stance towards, say, the covenant code, holistic material in texts like Exodus was subversive, that it meant to kind of imitate and borrow the prestige of its source material while cutting the layers out from underneath it. So the classic example of this in Deuteronomy is Deuteronomy 12 requires worship only in one cultic site. And it does this in relation to and uses the wording of a law that we have in Exodus 20:24 about creating altars. And Exodus 20:24 allows altars to be proliferated. So you can build altars all over the place. And Deuteronomy 12 takes up the language, this is sometimes called lemmatic citation, takes up the lemmas of Exodus 20 and repurposes them for a law that is directly in contradiction to that Exodus 20 law. So one possibility here is that this is a kind of subversive reuse. Another possibility, and one that I end up going with in this book, as I rethought these examples and thought about how to interpret them in light of what I see as the larger project, another possibility is that Dee doesn't mean to subvert this earlier material, but instead that the earlier material has kind of proven because of historical developments to be untenable. And instead, the Deuteronomic authors really like that earlier material and are trying to revive it and resuscitate it, and that requires making some changes to it. But because the Deuteronomic authors are such big fans, because they're so sympathetic in many ways to that earlier material that's now been proven untenable, they find a way to rework it and revive it. And so this ends up being a much more ironic view of the way that earlier source material has been engaged. So this is one example of the way that I've changed my mind over time. There are other ways too. There are also just some kind of long-standing problems that I had a hard time with, that I feel like I've been able to work out, and so I've offered new arguments that I wouldn't have offered, say, 10 years ago, because I just hadn't come to a solution yet. I tend to sit on problems for a long time, and so I have to work with them. Would that I were quicker to figure them out, but this is an example.
Thank you for the conversation. I know I said Hebrew scriptures back in the day. How we did Bel-Alzim, the criticism, of course, Yahweh, Diostic, and priestly. And so just how do you stand on those approaches? So as you used to on me, and out of the counter, what's the based out that's still doing that, and then where do you fall as you move around?
Yeah, so the field of Pentateuchal studies, you will be surprised, perhaps, if you're not on top of these issues, and there's no reason you should be. But the field of Pentateuchal studies is rivet. It is a hotbed of the base, when the stakes are low, the emotion run high, it's staying. That's the case in the study of Pentateuch. And so what Professor Hopkins refers to, what's referred to oftentimes as the documentary hypothesis or the new documentary hypothesis. This was especially in the Anglophone world, but not only for much of the last 150 years and even more, the dominant model for understanding the composition of the Pentateuch. And it was put to various ends. Aaron made reference to Louis Wellhausen's historical reconstruction of Israelite religion that uses the documentary hypothesis, and Wellhausen really popularized this idea all the way back in the 1870s and subsequently. More recently, really starting in like the 1960s and certainly into the 1970s, the center or the heart of Pentateuchal studies really developed and congealed in continental Europe. And there was a rejection of the documentary hypothesis. And I would say it's still the case that the kind of the strength of Pentateuchal studies is especially in continental Europe, especially in Germany, much less in the UK now than maybe once was the case. The German approach, really following this particular scholar, Rolf Rentor, has moved away from the documentary hypothesis and is really anti-documentary in certain ways. In the last 15 or 20 years, there's been a kind of resurgence of the documentary hypothesis. It's been mostly in Israel and in the United States. Our colleague, Professor Chevelle, is a good example of one of a handful of us scholars who argue in favor of a new formulation of the documentary hypothesis. And this goes back to Israeli scholars like Menachem Paran, Baruch Schwartz. We actually just a couple weeks ago had a little Pentateuch colloquium here in Chicago, and we presented a festschrift to Baruch Schwartz. He has ended up teaching a number of scholars who have taken prominent positions, so at Yale, at Princeton, at NYU, here in Chicago, and there's been a kind of resurgence of what we have termed the neo-documentarian approach. This has been met with consternation and some irritation by our European colleagues, and so the ribbonness of the wheel continues in certain ways, but I think it's, for a lot of scholars who continue to work on the documentary hypothesis, a question of the baby and the bathwater, right? That we would join with our European colleagues who reject the documentary hypothesis in many of their critiques of earlier formulations of this theory. But we would say it still holds when one revises and adds nuance to the theory. So yeah, believe it or not, this is a kind of hotbed of controversy these days.
Run.
From
Thing is a much what I like to I really did then the more what the books which was I applied here I really in my then consider well into the well then be done on pizza and everyone I'm like always been to take here to and be getting to where and but that I carbon statement really done the cover the photo too is that your first is to mind what the space but brings at it closer with brings the traditionally could certainly we bid that man followed and the album going right and the photo understood that follow we were speculating and glad and I done when my photos were too so but precisely as I usually get testosterone that is that shows me traditional narratives that have to do with the gods, which applies to most cases. So, I like a lot, and I think I'm going to work for that approximation. So, one biggest question is how controversial is that? And that was the most certificate around, but just send out the links to shoot and then Deuteronomy and the Torah. It does get when you have those different clues divided by by use of a story like that wasn't to generation with the clients or any others. Obviously there's the eternal being is European voice has the humanities in view, but you see the way that it was quality to me. I think so many of
constructing also really well, or is it getting out that is it possible that they find up being saying this is a that's a big idea, and then these technology are just reflecting difference about different styles on the Chinese demand. Not only that we don't say different groups, that is not so sad we see it like it really affecting about it is alive. Think about it, a spokesperson what he did.
Yeah. No, I think the difficulty of doing this work is the part that the answer, I think, is they're doing both of these things, right? That some of what they're responding to are received traditions that are not necessarily in written body. And that in other cases, I think very clearly we have examples of Deuteronomic authors using these other Pentateuchal works, what we call the Eloistic source and the Eloistic source. The main work that D is using is this Eloistic source, but then it's also using source material that is non-Israelite and non-Judean, especially Mesopotamian material. And it's probably using other things that we can't identify because we don't have copies of them. But I do think that in some cases, it's working from a kind of traditional knowledge of these stories, these traditions. It certainly doesn't feel constrained to follow the written traditions that it's interacting with. And so I also think probably whatever it's receiving in terms of traditional material that's not great, it doesn't feel constrained by that either, right? And so I think it's a highly creative process that nonetheless is using a lot of source material. You know, sometimes people think, oh, if it's using source material, that it's not very creative. I would say just opposite, right? That it's highly creative. But it means that it's difficult for us sometimes to identify where the source material comes from. And I do cover this in your work all the time too, right? And so being able to say what we want to say about things, we're oftentimes limited by the amount of evidence that we have. Now, in terms of the question of how controversial it is to read this material as literature with a particular set of ideas, and that those ideas might differ from those of other biblical authors. On the one hand, I would say this is not very controversial at all. I would say one of the only or one of the strongest consensus positions among scholars who work on the Pentateuch is that it speaks with multiple voices. And so the possibility that there are these distinctive voices, these different perspectives, this is something that is pretty well endorsed. Where it tends to be controversial, and this is not a small thing, and this applies also even to those who accept the idea of multiple authorship in the Pentateuch, is a lot of these readers are reading from a religious perspective, one that understands the text as scriptural. And so, one of the issues that I deal with in thinking about the text as literature versus as scripture is there's a lot of second-person address in the book of Deuteronomy. You do this, you do that. Well, the effect that it has upon the reader is oftentimes for them to sort of supplement or for somehow set aside the characterization within the text, so that second person address is not one character, Moses, speaking to other characters, the Israelites, but instead somehow a disembodied voice or even a divine voice speaking to the reader. Oftentimes people are sort of aware of this problem to some extent, but they'll say, well, there's a kind of metalepsis that's going on, and so ultimately the recipient is the reader, or they might even say, look, we're reading this excess scripture within religious communities. It is speaking to us, right, which is a surface theological claim, and will tend to collapse these levels. And in this sense, I would say that this is controversial because I'm pushing back and saying, you can't do that the way you're doing. And so people don't like being told no. And so there's a sense in which I'm saying no to certain things and making it harder for some of the theological moves that are taken with this text to be accomplished. It's also the case that we see this in critical scholarship. We see it reflected in certain theories of the history of composition. So on this point of the second person address, some have argued that there was an earlier stage in which the second person address was not set within a Mosaic framework. It wasn't Moses as the speaker, but instead there was an earlier stage where these laws were divinely voiced. And so their second person address wasn't to these Israelite characters in the story, but instead to the reader. And they say that the text was secondarily set within this narrative framework with Moses as the speaker and the Israelites as the recipients. But, originally this was divine privilege law is the way that it's described. And I would say that I think that this argument, however clever it is, I think it's wrong, but I think this argument is one that is influenced by a scriptural model of reading. And so it's presented as a historical argument about the compositional history of this text, when in fact I think that this probably comes out of the modern religious reception of the text, and that urge to have the text speak to the religious audience. So in this sense, I think it is controversial. Well, and here and ushering it.
So perhaps I think you perhaps addressed this in your discussion of the second person address here. But to follow up Esther Walsh's point, I'm interested in why you think Deuteronomy becomes this out of fertile ground for their affairs. Purely, right, I'm interested in the second couple period to now to talk about. Rather than scrolls out and write its reception of New Testament citation, why is it particularly productive? I found it to was.
Yeah. So I think that Deuteronomy probably is as popular as it is in its early reception because it contains so much law. And so I'm arguing that it's not law itself, it's a story about law. But I think because of the way that early Judaism and early Christianity became so halakhically oriented, right, so legally oriented, and because it was so easy to sublimate the distinctive story that is in the Deuteronomic text when they're combined with the rest of the Pentateuch. Because the story that it tells, the story of the Israelites journey through the wilderness and preparations to enter into the promised land, the reception of these laws, is a story that is already encountered by readers who are reading the Pentateuch. It's already encountered before they get to Deuteronomy. And so the story that they encounter in Deuteronomy, I think, is somewhat belated. And so it's easy to then harmonize that with the story that's already been told in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. I think a logical response to reading Deuteronomy is, I already know the story. And before it floods, when it comes to the legal material, it treats the same legal topics, but with sometimes different details than what we get in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. And so what we see in early Judaism is an attempt to do kind of harmonistic reading of this legal material. And that, of course, then becomes a kind of a concern of early Christianity as well. Are these laws to be followed? Are they not? Which ones? And so I think because it contains so much legal speech, and that's really what it is, right? That these are speeches by Moses that convey the laws that he claims to have received at Florida. I think that's why it becomes so important. And that's why I think also it becomes increasingly less important as Christianity develops within the Christian context, and it continues to be important in a certain way within the Jewish context, although then the interpretation of that material becomes even more important than the material itself within Judaism, right, with the development of the Talmud. So So I think there's a way in which it gets left behind in each of these traditions, but in different ways. Gary.
I think the lack of concatenation. So what I'm wondering is, I didn't do the same families to another questions, but with a system angle, if you were to bring this up to an Orthodox Jewish community, and let's say you have a maximum influence over about anything, right? For no reason.
That seems like probably that's what I have to think. Yeah, I like it.
To the voters, they really, really credit what you're saying, right?
Yes.
As far as the thing about this historic law, not mentioning law, given this is a community that will sometimes state how the body literature, right? So literature that is narrative and will revive restrictions obligating from that. Do you expect that this would change how they think about Deuteronomy?
If I met maximum influence, I'm taking seriously the hypothetical. If I had maximum influence, I think it would be very challenging to a lot of the assumptions and practices of that community in the way that they read biblical material. I think it would be very difficult for them to make slight adjustments, not because there wouldn't be, certain connections that they would make between, say, the reading of agadic narrative or reading halakhic legal material and their concerns for each of these. But because what I'm suggesting is human authorship. I characterize the literature that's in here as political allegory. I'm trying to situate it historically in a way that would introduce problems with this community and the contemporary reception of the text as scripture. So I think, I guess I suspect that if I had the maximum influence, that I would be causing some significant problems in a community like this, which is one of the reasons that I don't have maximum influence in a community like this, right? I'm very rarely invited to teach in a community like this. I've been invited on rare occasions to Orthodox communities. I get invited much more often to conservative or Reform Jewish communities, in the Christian context, much more often to liberal progressive contexts than conservative ones. They know what I do on some level, and they've decided against it. So I'm especially appreciative of the hypothetical here, because it's optimistic in a way that I think it's, well, maybe I should say it this way. I'm not looking to convert anyone. So my appeal to readers is, if you want to understand this, I can help you. But that's not necessarily going to be acceptable for every kind of Bible reader, and I'm okay with that. So yeah, I'm not trying to convert non-critical readers into critical readers. I'm making the case for what a critical reading can do, and I think there's folks who read the Bible say, I really want to understand this. I think I can help, but I also recognize that they may not want to accept the kinds of arguments that I make. Does that make sense?
Thank you for this over the conversation. You mentioned the Hittite text, and I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit your interest in these. I said it also the interest of the field. You also mentioned the recent minds from the Valentine shouts. Yes, yeah, and the other souls.
Yeah. So there are Hittite materials some treaty or treaty-like texts. There are many more Hittite materials. Many moons ago, I read a lot of Hittite material. I don't read as much now, but there are these treaty and treaty-like texts that have some kind of structural similarities to what we see in Deuteronomy, and some people have argued on that basis that what we have in Deuteronomy is itself a treaty, that the whole text is a treaty text, which I think is wrong. But there's been a trend in the history of the study of the Hebrew Bible to look for ancient Near Eastern parallel material, and on the basis of these comparisons to shed light on this material, which I think is a good thing. But there's also been a tendency towards what some people at pejoratively call parallel mania, right? And finding 8 of every 3 relevant parallels for a text. And I would say that the Hittite material here is similar in a general sense, in a typological sense. Does the Deuteronomic text and these Hittite texts, do they participate in a wider general phenomenon in the ancient Near East? I would say yes. But is there a direct literary connection between them? I would say no, and I would say that for a few reasons. The parallels aren't particularly tight. It's also the case that the Hittite texts are, of course, written in Hittite, which is an Indo-European language written in cuneiform. And the dating of these texts is somewhat removed from what we can argue for the dating of Deuteronomic material. And we have a hard time finding vectors of transmission between the two. And so whenever I'm doing this kind of comparative work and considering the possibility of a direct literary connection, I'm always asking the questions of votive, means, and opportunity, right? And votive is always kind of a slippery quantities. You can kind of work creatively to come up with a motive. But means and opportunity are harder. So what Israelite and Judean knew Hittite, that's something that is very difficult to establish. What was the opportunity for accessing these texts? They probably, they're separated by 500 or more years in some cases, and so it's quite difficult to establish vectors of transmission. That's different from what we have in the Neo-Assyrian material. And Levitchan referred to Tel Tayanat, which is a site in very southern Turkey, kind of the northern Levant, and there was a copy of this text called the Esarhaddon Succession Treaty that was found at Tel Tayanat. Chicago dug at Tayanat back in the 1930s, and then in the last 20 years, there's been a new excavation there run by the University of Toronto. And so about 10 years ago, this text was found in the sanctuary complex. It seems to be a text that was a display copy. We can tell that based on the way that the tablet is arranged. And this is important because it's an example of this text that was found in a Levantine context in the West. And this text is a text that is attempting to secure the royal succession of the Neo-Assyrian Empire in the move from Esarhaddon to his son Ashurbanipal. And the Neo-Assyrian dynasty was one where there was a lot of internal political intrigue, and Esarhaddon, his father Sennacherib, had been killed in a coup, and so Esarhaddon was trying to secure, for his son what would hopefully be a smooth transition of power. And so he sent out copies of this oath, this loyalty oath, throughout the entire empire. And at this time, the former northern kingdom of Israel had been converted into an Assyrian province. And the southern kingdom, Judah, was a client state. It wasn't a full-blown province, but that's probably just because it wasn't important enough, it wasn't threatening enough to actually turn into a province. But it looks like in this case that we have these precise language parallels between what we see in Deuteronomy 13 and Deuteronomy 28 and this particular Esarhaddon succession tree test. And so then the question of means and opportunity are important here. Well, we've just been talking about all of this intensive political and diplomatic interactions during the 7th century between Judah and the Neo-Assyrian Empire. We see examples of this text in Levantine context, and so some have posited that maybe there was a copy of this in Jerusalem. Maybe there was a copy of this in Samaria. We don't know exactly. We haven't found a copy in these contexts. But we can also look at other examples called Hebrew texts in the Hebrew Bible, and we see that there's influence of Akkadian language. And so it's probably not the case that there's high Akkadian literacy, but it looks like there's at least some Akkadian literacy among Judean scribes. And so again, if we talk about means and opportunity, I think we can check these boxes with the Assyrian material in a way that we can't effectively classes within the type material. Okay, and these. Oh, I'm getting the signal with the watch, so maybe we should start to it.
Yeah, okay. So thank you very much, Professor Stackert. The next team card is in May, which will be a presentation on Sarah Frederick's new book on environmental ethics and Shannon and tireless studies with our science by the use of case study from Islamic studies. And that will be the last one for the year. We'll continue next year. I would like to use this opportunity to thank the two of you, especially. And I wanted one last question to plug your new book, which I think is the next book, the commentary at Deuteronomy. And is that Yale Anchor or no?
No, this is the International Exegetical Commentary on the Old Testament.
And so in closing, I just, one of the things that I was fascinated by this in relation to Captain is also the different types of writing academic prose, commentary versus narrative writing. And so I know it's great excitement about your commentary coming out and for the opportunity to have another Dean's Forum around it. So thanks to the two of you. There is a raffle, and there are books available in the back, and you have the conclusion, the results of the raffle.
Yeah, so we had more of those.
Another one there.
At the main
What is it? I'm going to put it.
And instead, Dante.